Greetings, everyone around the world joining us on this very special panel to talk about how China's zero COVID protests connect to the past. I'm Bates Gill. I am the executive director of the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And it is my enormous pleasure and privilege to be able to moderate today's event. We have a fantastic group of people who will be speaking to the issues that we've just raised in relation to the recent COVID protests and how they connect to the past, present, and future. What we have with us today are a great group who have lived experience, having lived and worked in China for many, many years, also who have been themselves either direct witnesses or even directly involved in events in China of dissent and protest. I'll give a brief introduction of each of them, and then we'll turn to some of our discussion. First, very pleased to be joined by Dr. Wang Dan. Dr. Wang, of course, is a prominent Chinese pro-democracy advocate who was a student leader during the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, for which he was punished, received prison sentence, but was allowed to leave China in exile, and has since that time received his PhD from Harvard University and has been a professor in Taiwan and elsewhere. Importantly, he has founded the Dialogue China, a think tank and newsletter. We're also joined from Beijing by Melinda Liu. Melinda was the first Newsweek bureau chief in China in the early 1980s, and for much of the time since, she has lived and worked in China. She is still today the Newsweek chief based in Beijing, but has also spent much of her time as a journalist in other parts of the world. And of course, she was resident in China at the time of the Tiananmen Square and has followed issues in relation to dissent and protest in China, and is even today writing and publishing in relation to the COVID-19 protests that we've just seen. Thanks so much, Melinda, for joining us. Also with us is Dr. Wu Guoguang. Dr. Wu Guoguang is a senior fellow in the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He's also a senior research scholar at the Stanford University Center on China's Economy and Institutions. Guoguang was a policy advisor and speechwriter for Zhao Ziyang back in the 1980s, and he later received his PhD from Princeton University. I'm very proud and pleased to say that Guoguang is a colleague at the Center for China Analysis, and thanks very much for joining us. Last and certainly not least is the inestimable Orville Schell, who is the Arthur Ross Director of the Center for U.S. China Relations at the Asia Society. He's also a vice president of the Asia Society, and again, very happy to say a colleague with the Asia Society. He, as you know, is an author, a commentator. He has, since the 1970s, lived and worked in China and covered issues in relation to Chinese politics and much, much more. Orville, thanks so much for being able to join us today. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a remarkable past week. I think all of us were in some respects taken aback, or if not entirely surprised, but at least deeply intrigued by what we saw unfold in China over the last week or so. Certainly the most widespread and most public displays of anger, of grievances, and even open political dissent that we've seen in China for a very, very long time, and certainly the most we've seen, I would say, in the period of Xi Jinping's leadership. And of course, coming so quickly after what seemed to be Xi Jinping's triumphant receipt of a new mandate to lead China, ostensibly for the next 5 years, but perhaps for even longer. I think the world is still scratching their heads a bit about what this has all meant. How did this come to pass? How has it drawn from and tried to connect to so many other instances of dissent and protest across China's history in the 20th and 21st centuries? And has this most recent set of events been a signal of something new? Can we expect that the kinds of grievances and capabilities that were demonstrated by persons in getting onto the streets and trying to express themselves, their anger, not just about the COVID-19 lockdowns, but I think about broader anxieties and problems and grievances which they see emerging from the Chinese body politic of today? Is this going to continue going forward? What sort of lessons from these most recent events can be taken forward potentially to see maybe similar ways of expressing dissent and protest in the future? I'd like to try to cover all of these issues. And again, I can't imagine a better group of people that we could have to do it. So why don't we just jump right in and begin getting some of your thoughts. I wanted to start with Guoguang and Melinda, maybe, and Wang Dan and Orville, obviously, most welcome to chime in here. But let's first talk a little bit about some of the origins. Love to get your thoughts, Guoguang, about the origins of these protests and why this time. I mean, there's been plenty of protests during the Xi Jinping era, but they've tended to be localized and not national. That was what was so remarkable, wasn't it? And they spread so quickly this time. Do you have some thoughts about why that was the case? Why did these protests erupt, and why were they so national and widespread?
Thank you, Base. Really pleasure to join this prestigious panel to talk about China's protest. Your questions are really great questions. So to make the answers brief, first of all, I would like to say it seems that origins of the current protest is basically they are driven by how to say, so the Chinese regimes pushing ordinary persons, ordinary people's daily life to the somewhere maybe below the bottom line. So basically, I like to say it's not about, I feel it's difficult to use something like human rights to describe what people in the protest they demand for, because when we talk about human rights, we at least have to say human beings living as human beings rather than simply, bodies as biological things. I mean, in the past more than 30 years since Tiananmen, it seems that there has been declining momentum of social resistance to the regime. Of course, there could be due to the effectiveness of Chinese Communist Party's stability maintenance system. But on the other side, to many observers, people could think that so the momentum of resistance from ordinary people are not really strong. And so we know that in the past 30 years, there are rampant corruption of officials, and there are increasing gap between the rich and the poor, and a lot of social, economic, environmental disasters. But we didn't see a lot of protests like what we are watching today. So why actually today, after what I just said, like a declining momentum of resistance, why suddenly the protest arose like this. I think, yeah, that's basically because in the particularly with the Xi Jinping leadership, the Xi Jinping also wrongly interpreted this declining momentum of social resistance in his own words, in commenting the collapse of Soviet Union. So 更无一个是男儿. So there's no any single true man in China, in the communist world, to save actually the Communist Party regime. So in his eyes, in such big country of China, so nobody can be really good fella to rebel against Communist Party if he is really taking hardline policies. But I think it seems how to say, so when that's why Xi Jinping since 10 years ago he came into power, he has practiced that policy to put Chinese citizens on ground, actually to bully them in every possible way. So in that way, so Chinese people, their rights are deprived not only as a social existence, but even as biological existence, their basic biological rights of moving around in their yard, in their neighborhood, in their communities, in actually, getting food, getting vegetables for everyday meals, coming to visit doctors when they are in bad sickness. So particularly with the anti-pandemic measures suggested by Xi Jinping, proposed by Xi Jinping, or under leadership of Xi Jinping in person, in his own words, okay? He led the whole campaign battle like that in person. So people's rights, freedom, were actually deprived to the minimum degree. So in this way, you don't want to talk about political issues, even you don't have any intention to rebel against the regime, even you just want to live as biological entity in China, still you got numerous tremendous difficulties. So I think that's why. So maybe we can cite Mao Zedong, the CCP leader. So when your repression is really, really hard, so the rebellion against your repression would come actually. So I think that explains the origin of this wave of protest.
That's very powerful. That's very, very powerful, Guoguang. It seems as if Xi Jinping needs to go back and read his Mao Zedong to understand a little bit better how the Chinese people might be feeling. Melinda, what are your thoughts about, what are some of the precursors or underlying motivations and reasons why this happened now? Why now?
I think Guoguang was very accurate in talking about some of the societal environment and political environment. If the question is why this past weekend, why 1 week ago did it happen, I think there was a combination of things we could have expected, and then also an element of serendipity, things that we didn't really see happening, but that really meant something. The thing that we could have expected is that there was so much expectation for years, really, or at least a year, that after the big party Congress in mid-October, that would be the opportunity for us to see some change, us to see some relaxation of the COVID or tweaking of the COVID policy. Certainly, what you can say for sure, because I've been living here, I was stuck in the States in 2020 for 8 months because my visa had expired when I was overseas. And then I came back in October, and then I couldn't leave, and nobody expected that the pandemic effects would still be in effect now. But 2 years ago, one and a half years ago, everybody knew that it was going to be a delicate political period until the party Congress. And then, after the party Congress, Xi Jinping would have his third term, then there's an opportunity for something new to start. You know, it's almost like finish one phase and begin another. So I think people have been building up and building up in terms of their expectations. And there's something called the Tocqueville effect, after the famous writer who was actually talking about the environment in which the French Revolution took place. And that the thesis there was that the most dangerous point is not the moment of deepest, darkest, most heavy-handed repression. The most dangerous point for a regime is, or a government, is actually the point where people have some expectation of change, and then their expectations run ahead of the reality. So because I myself felt it, I can certainly say that there was an expectation that something had to change after the Party Congress in October. And indeed, there was already in process a plan to change, a plan to, they called it the optimization of zero COVID. It was a more surgical approach, less heavy-handed approach, less costly approach. And they had like 20 measures that they rolled out on November 11, which were supposed to be this grand new scheme. And the problem was, number one, it wasn't enough change. Number two, it was implemented rather poorly because local authorities were given a lot of autonomy to decide when and how far to implement some of these optimized measures. And when the cases started surging again, of course, there's a pesky other player here, which is the COVID virus, which no one can really predict or control. Then these local authorities clamped down again. And in some ways, you can't really blame them individually because, let's face it, the enforcement of some of these zero COVID restrictions was left to the all volunteer, not professional neighborhood committees who suddenly had a new lease on life because their relevance, quite frankly, had been receding dramatically. Suddenly they were, and these were some of them were retired people, some of them were people who didn't work full time, and suddenly they're being tasked with a very complicated administration role. Okay, so the implementation is botched, lockdowns are announced again, and then came this serendipitous thing, which even I thought sounded kind of ludicrous or outlandish to begin with, which was the World Cup effect. Okay, so what does that mean? All right, after the Party Congress, clearly even the government was saying, okay, now the time is to look at the outside world again. Xi Jinping will start traveling again, and he was like, he was on a blitz throughout Asia, the APEC summit, meeting with Biden, all sorts of things, meeting all these leaders. Everyone was looking outward, and the Chinese people were also saying, okay, let's look outward now. Of course, part of that would be, and maybe our borders will open and people will come back and we will be able to travel again. Well, it just turns out that the World Cup was happening. Now, the World Cup is not, the Chinese audience for the World Cup is not intimately fascinated by elite politics in China. However, there is 500 million of them who watch. And so that's a lot of people. And also many of them are predominantly male, competitive in personality, maybe the type of person who might jump up and go out and act on their emotions, because for those of us who were here in the 80s, the first protests that happened in the Deng era were actually just raucous gatherings of young men after sporting events in the workers' stadium. Okay, so then what happened with this World Cup thing? Well, first of all, in the very beginning, people started watching and they were looking at huge crowds of spectators in Qatar, shouting, screaming, laughing, crying, winning, losing, without masks and in person, close together. And people had to wonder for 3 years, what have we been doing? Look, the outside world is actually living a normal life. Worse, the Chinese state-run broadcaster CCTV probably saw that this was awkward. The comparison of this joyous and maskless crowd in gutter and, the lockdown back home. At that time, probably a quarter of the population of China was under some form of lockdown. So they started choosing and editing the streamed images that they were going to play to avoid showing spectators. So, which is easy to do. You as a consumer of the live stream, you can choose what camera angles that are available that you wish to choose. And so there were suddenly very few images of the crowds. It was mostly just the players, the referees, and that was kind of it. But it became not only silly for those who knew it was happening, but it was also very obvious. And that's when a large sector of these, hundreds of millions of people said, hey, wait a minute, they're not even showing us the crowds. This is like sports. This is ridiculous. And that's, according to friends that I've talked to, that's when the light bulb went on and people thought, oh, we've been lied to. We've been tricked. The outside world is not dying in droves from COVID because they have a bad COVID policy. They're actually having fun and living a normal life, and we're the ones who are suffering. So I think these two things kind of came together and resulted, it's part of the reason why last weekend was the weekend when it all kind of came out.
Yeah. I mean, so it's really interesting. It's as Guoguang was saying, it's sort of a deeper, almost biological grievance emerging, but then sparked in some ways by these more, near-term expectations brought people to this. It's quite interesting. I wanted to turn our conversation a little bit more to the question of connectivity of what we've seen over the last week to what we've seen in other instances in China. And I thought maybe get Wang Dan and Orville in on this conversation. Wang Dan, when you were watching what happened across China, it must have evoked a lot of very powerful memories and even emotions for you. Now with the benefit of a week or so's reflection, do you draw parallels? Do you see parallels? Do you see mostly differences or similarities? How would you compare and contrast what we've just seen to the events, say, of the spring of 1989?
Thank you, Bess. And yes, watching videos of this protest and hearing the slogans like "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" has really taken me back to 1989, for when I was a university student protesting in Tiananmen Square, hoping that the government would listen to people's voice and would push for political reform. But as you know, the government's response was Tiananmen massacre. But watching the ongoing protest, I believe many people immediately connect the current protest to the 1989 democracy movement. For the past 33 years, the current protests are the only mass demonstrations in mainland China to call on the Communist Party for systematic reforms or even step down. So personally, I'm indeed inspired to see Chinese people standing in solidarity again. But even though we see many similarities between 1989 and now, by all means, we should not consider that this is 1989 again. Now, let me talk about the similarity first. The most obvious similarity is that university students are again at the front line of the demonstrations. Mm-hmm. This might come as a surprise to a lot of people, because after the CCP spent years brainwashing young generation in schools, many people may think that most Chinese younger generation would never question the authorities, or they will choose to steer away from politics and focus instead more on their personal well-being. This situation was somewhat accurate during the pre-zero COVID years. But ever since zero COVID policy was implemented and repeatedly extended, the resulting economic slowdown was felt throughout the country, I have to say, particularly by younger generation. After realizing laying down, we call it 躺平, is not the best way to resolve problems they faced, younger generation had no choice to resort to fight back in order to survive. I doubt that most of younger generation really know about what happened in 1989. The current protest originated from people's natural desire for a better life and for protecting their personal freedoms. This is very similar to the 1989 movement. And I'm very much touched actually to see these young people are leading the protest and to speak their mind loud and clear once again. Now, differences. First, even though students again are at the forefront of this ongoing movement, the current situation is completely different from 1989. Back to 1989, student organizations from universities was in charge of organizing protest. When we heard rumors about Chinese government going to crack down on the protest, student organizations had direct vote to collectively decide on whether we would stay or leave the Tiananmen Square. But current protest, however, is largely decentralized compared to 1989. Protesters now are more mobilized with information being easily shared through social media. They copied the strategy of 2019 protests in Hong Kong. We call it be water strategy. This is quite different from what happened in 1989. Secondly, in 1989, when we first heard about the rumor, most people were in disbelief that our government will use force to crack down on us. And during the demonstrations, we always considered our action patriotic. Majority of Chinese citizens had this belief as well. All we wanted was for China to have a better future. However, when tanks and soldiers marched through the street of Beijing, it was very clear that the Chinese government was never what we thought it was. And 33 years has passed. The Chinese government has suppressed countless peaceful protests, arrested a lot of protesters and dissidents. And the CCP's ability to censor speech have also improved. So it's without a doubt that the Chinese government will continue to crack down on the current protest, though very unlikely in the form of Tiananmen massacre. So I think those protesters today are even braver than us because they knew the danger and they still went to the street. And thirdly, one key difference between now and then is that even though the Chinese government has erased every truth of history on the 89 democracy movement and the Tiananmen massacre, majority of Chinese people still lived through that time. Regardless of their view over the 1989 protest, I believe a majority still believe that the Chinese government opening fires toward its own people was never the right action. With most people still aware of experience of 1989, I believe that the outcome of this movement will be different. We cannot predict whether the outcome will be for better or for worse, but I'm certain that people will try their best, not let the tragic ending of 1989 replay itself. Anyway, in 2022, the protesters, I think, have turned a new page for China for the past 33 years. For the first time in 3 decades, the political environment will no longer be the same in China. The ongoing protest will have significant influence on Chinese society moving forward. There's still a long road before freedom and democracy are implemented in China. But for past 2 weeks, I have seen a new beginning. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Wang Dan. That's fantastic. Great reflections across those 3 decades, I think. And I think a little bit later in our panel, we'll have a chance to dig in a little bit deeper as to what we can expect going forward. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. But it sounds as if you were quite encouraged. And Orville, you've been traveling to China since the 1970s. I know you've been witness on many occasions to different forms of Chinese people's expressions of dissent, of protest, of grievance. How do you draw parallels or contrasts with what we've seen just this past week to previous things you've seen and experienced and assessed in Chinese contemporary history?
Well, first, Bates, let me say it's wonderful that the Center in U.S. China Relations, which I direct, can collaborate with you and the new Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society. And I hope we'll do many more such events. As I look back to my sort of early associations with China, I think one thing that really impresses me, and this was absolutely true when I first went to China in 1975, and Mao Zedong was still alive, the Cultural Revolution was still going, and that is that when you look into Chinese society from the outside, the Chinese Communist Party's sort of highest goal is to make things look harmonious, peaceful, and undisturbed. And if you had asked me in 1975, when I was working in the Shanghai Electrical Machinery Factory or in the Dajai, model agricultural brigade, if there was anything churning beneath the surface, I would have thought you were bereft of your senses. Everything seemed fine. And it seemed like China, that was China, and China would continue that way ad infinitum. And yet, very few years afterwards, what happened? Well, first, Zhou Enlai died. And Tiananmen Square filled with people to celebrate his life, but also obliquely to criticize the Cultural Revolution in Mao. And then a very few years after that, the Gang of Four was gone, Mao had been overthrown. And the next thing I knew, I was walking by Democracy Wall. It had just sprung out of nowhere at a car barn in Xidan, in sort of the western part of the city. People started hanging up posters and having debates, and thousands of people came up. So what does that say to us? Well, it says, I think, a couple things very quickly. First of all, it's really important that we all remember that yes, China has a Chinese Communist Party, and yes, it's been ruling since 1949, but it also has more than a century of a very deep and august democratic tradition that first expressed itself in the May 4th movement in 1919, but many times since then. There are these sort of lava vents, these upwellings of this sentiment. That doesn't mean that it embraces all of society, but it means that China has had a concern with this. This isn't something that just is alien or it comes from the outside. The second thing I would say is that in my experience, because in an autocratic society, it's so difficult to express yourself, as Wang Dan says, the costs are so high. It's amazing anybody expresses themselves at all. But what does happen is that the sort of innate nature of human beings in our modern age since the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, is to want to have a reasonable modicum of freedom in their lives. And when they don't have it, grievances pool up. You can't see them, you can't feel them, they don't express themselves in a society that doesn't allow them to express themselves, but they are there. And I think that's a bit what we see now, is that Xi Jinping's had a decade of sort of techno-autocracy. It got really exaggerated in many ways by the pandemic crackdown. And beneath the surface of things, this aquifer of grievance, of disaffection, builds and builds and builds. And then it finds some little moment, nobody can predict it, and it jumps out. And where it's all going to go, we don't know. But it's only to say that I think that we have to be very careful as foreigners looking in from the outside, don't imagine that Chinese too have the same instincts we do. They want to be able to express themselves a bit. They want to be able to live lives that are a little bit free, at least. They want to, it's part of the instinct of the age, which is to be individuals and to be able to speak out and be heard. And that's not happening in China. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that there's, Mao Zedong loved to speak of contradictions. And he said there were two kinds. One was a contradiction among the people. You could solve that by discussion and whatnot. But there was another kind, antagonistic contradictions, 敌我矛盾, and these could only be solved by conflict and violence. And I think there is an absolute conflict between China's present political system and Xi's very extreme form of censorship and crackdown, and the basic innate human instincts which animate the 21st and animated the 20th century. And you can crack down and control and crack down and control, but that will not make people feel very happy. And ultimately, there's going to be some sort of a collision. And we've seen the first sort of suggestion of that in the last weeks.
Wow, thanks so much, Orville, for reflecting on those very, very key points that, it's not as if China hasn't had this tradition, and it's always sort of beneath the surface, and it finds ways to emerge. I mean, I reflect on my own experience in 1986 and 1987, living in China, and just feeling the enthusiasm and the outpouring of excitement among the Chinese people about the possibilities of reform and opening that even burst out then in December of 1986 in forms of protest all across China, which of course led to the ouster of Hu Yaobang in early 1987, and of course with his death in 1989 was what sparked the outpouring of sentiment and grievance and dissent, which converged on Tiananmen Square.
If I may say, I think what's so interesting about the comparison you've just sort of lofted, yes, Hu Yaobang was the reason everybody ended up in the square in 1989. Yep. And it didn't mean that Hu Yaobang was a paradigm of democratic governance or open society thinking, but he wasn't bad. But the same thing in a certain way is beginning to happen around Jiang Zemin. And we have the memorial for Jiang Zemin happening this coming Tuesday, right in the same place where it happened for Hu Yaobang. Now, I don't predict we're going to have another 1989 because the constabulary forces, surveillance, and all of these things are much stricter. But there is now a tendency to look at Jiang Zemin in the same way. So these funerals are very parlous, dangerous business for the Chinese Communist Party, and yet they cannot avoid them.
Yeah. So it's good to recall then this depth of sentiment and just basic human instinct, beneath the surface that will come through that aquifer and find fissures, as it were, to release itself. I wanted to get Guoguang and Melinda also to reflect on this and tell us what they think they've seen over the past week and how it might compare or contrast with earlier episodes of dissent and protest. Melinda, do you have some thoughts on this? Is it more similar or dissimilar, and why?
I'm very much in agreement with Wang Dan that there are similarities, but this is not going to be a replay of 1989. Society has changed, the world has changed, and I think things have gotten quite a bit more complicated. And also, we're still in that period, so it's hard to assess what is that period going to be. I mean, you know, a few days of protest-filled activity cannot compare to the thousands and thousands of people who were in the square and protesting for months at a time. You know, I recall very early on, even before Hu Yaobang died on April 15th, 1989, there were bubblings, you know, sort of guerrilla protests, you know, people, you know, a bunch of young men on bicycles, you know, riding through the square. Some of it was actually, I believe, triggered by sporting events in those days, but they were very small. And I remember the big news that everyone was waiting for at the time, and I think this is one lesson that we can draw from 1989. The big news that everyone was waiting for was the state visit of Mikhail Gorbachev. Big deal, 30 years of Sino-Soviet friction was going to be done away with. It was like a big news event, but it wasn't the news event that really turned out to be the big one. And I remember even telling my editor, my Newsweek editor, you know, there are a lot of protests going on. Should we do a story about that as well, in addition to this big curtain raiser piece about Sino-Soviet relations? And I remember he said, oh, just throw a few lines into the major story. You know, we're really going to talk about Gorbachev now. Okay. And of course, I used to work Newsweek, it was a weekly. By the time that story came out, nobody really cared about Gorbachev so much. It was like, oh my God, there are all these people in the square, and they didn't leave. So number one, we cannot predict what is, you know, how things are going to go. They often do defy expectation. And then number two, we cannot predict how long things are going to take to play out. I distinctly remember being totally exhausted in late May 1989. My whole team had been working flat out for many, many weeks, and they all wanted to take a break. Many of them wanted to leave. Some of them wanted to go to Hong Kong and just have a weekend off and then come back. And so I just said, okay, those of you who feel you're burnt out, just go and leave and then come back. This, you know, people thought it was finished. There were still protesters in the square in late May, but it felt like very kind of a stagnant period almost, and everyone was exhausted. That is the danger sign, because not only are the protesters exhausted, but the leadership is exhausted as well. And when you're really tired and stressed and see no way out, you might make a bad decision. And so on the weekend of June 3rd and 4th, I actually was operating with a skeleton crew in terms of news gathering for Newsweek, because everyone had gone to take a break in Hong Kong, or sometimes in some cases they had left for good, thinking, well, this isn't happening, and so I'm going somewhere else. And so in fact, a lot of journalists were caught by their absence in Beijing when the blood really started flowing, and some of them managed to come back on Sunday morning and still take photographs and report. But there were some people who ended up being stuck outside. They had spent weeks here, and they missed the whole thing. So that the second message is, don't think you can predict how things are going to go. This is a very fluid situation. I can see many outcomes, possible outcomes. I can also see an outcome where the Communist Party ends up with a stronger hand. How does that work? Clearly, if you're smart, you'll see that, oops, there's something about Xi Jinping and his zero COVID policy that is not popular with the people. if I were a really smart senior official, maybe even a very loyal to Xi senior official, I would be looking around going, does anyone else see that the emperor has no clothes now? And if you were smart, you might say, maybe I should be the first one to point this out, because there are, the old factions are all gone. I was just recently reading Wu Guoguang's very, very expert piece on this in the China Leadership Monitor. All the rivals are gone. They've been purged, they've been retired, they've been co-opted, they've been intimidated, they've been threatened. And if you're a party elder, just about the only category that's left, you've been sidelined. They were not consulted the way they normally would have been for this party Congress. So there's no rivals left. So, but there have to be differences of opinion within the elite. And that's what we should be watching. That's the one thing that was very clear in 1989, that there was a power struggle going on in the leadership. There shouldn't be one now, because there are no factions left to struggle with Xi Jinping. But as Wu Guoguang's piece points out, there have to be new factions now. It's not possible to be totally unified.
Right. Thanks for that. And I think you've helped us segue a little bit there, Melinda, to maybe look ahead a bit. But before doing that, Guoguang, it'd be great to get your reflections. Having been so centrally involved yourself with Zhao Ziyang back in the late 80s. What was what's gone through your head as you've seen these events unfold in 2022? When you think back to earlier episodes, whether 89 or 86, 87, others in China, do you see some similarities, or do you mostly see some differences?
Yeah, I do share those points expressed by my peer panelists. So I also see a lot of similarities, but also differences. But here I would like to highlight maybe 2 or 3 points of differences. First of all, in the 1980s of China is mainly remembered as relatively maybe most liberal decades in history of the PRC. So at that time, so in 1989, actually before that, we saw a series of students' protests through the 1980s. And also in 1989, even in 1988, people widely expected that would be rise of demonstrations in 1989, as that year was anniversary year of May 1st movement, the French Revolution, the People's Republic establishment, things like that. So that means a lot of critical moments historically, in historical perspective. So that means in 1989, so everybody knew that people were in huge discontent with economic reform policies. I mean, particularly, those policies causing inflation, causing corruption, things like that. But today, I just mentioned earlier, so people thought that Xi Jinping is so, indeed he had his peak of power. And it seems that another side of forces disappeared from Chinese political dynamics. So only those leaders, those elites, so they play the game. So where are the Chinese people? It seems that they are only slavers, or you can do whatever you like to do to repress them, to bully them, to actually even kill them. So that's, the really difference. So, but when you don't expect this kind of rise of mass protest, I would say we as observers could be surprised. I guess maybe Xi Jinping is the person who is most surprised, and also, of course, who is most challenged. So I think that should give the dictators, including Xi Jinping himself, a lesson. So when you look down upon ordinary people, you think they are nothing. So when you think there are no any true men rising in China, and true women can do that. So actually, man can follow up. So I guess so. I mean, today the situation. Let me try to predict a little bit. So in 1989, so eventually, Wang Dan Xiaoping ordered People's Liberation Army to open fire at Wang Dan and his comrades and Chinese citizens, students in Tiananmen Square. So history of China was suddenly turned to the darker page until lasting today, the darker and darker. And today, when we are at the perhaps one of the darkest moment in Chinese history, I guess, so maybe the future could be brighter and brighter, because I share with all my colleagues point about, actually the protests already changed dynamics of Chinese political development. So before, as I mentioned, so those powerful guys, they think they can control everything. So with stability maintenance system established for more than 3 decades, and with really huge economic, military power, and also control and censorship of, internet, whatever seems under their control. But now the protesters joined the game, and even so we already have, seen actually, the retreat of the regime from the zero COVID policy. And this retreat will tell the protesters and also Chinese citizens, so when you stand up to defend your basic rights, so even the most powerful dictator, they have to maybe retreat strategically, but anyway, you gain some ground as protesters. Yeah, I think that's very important.
Wow, that's very powerful. Again, Guoguang. We're getting a bit closer to the end of our session, but I want to make sure we hear from everybody. Why don't we take up the point that Guoguang just made? Guoguang just said that he sees a turning point in the political history of China as a result of the episodes and events and incidents of the last week. Let's all take a chance of looking ahead a little bit and maybe respond to that thought from Guoguang. Wang Dan, when you look ahead now and reflecting on what we've seen over the past week, do you see a turning point? Are you encouraged, or are you a little bit more subdued in your enthusiasm, or what do you see coming ahead?
Yeah, I really agree with Professor Wu Guoguang, and I think past 2 weeks maybe represent a new era, where a new era is coming, and there are 2 characteristics of this new era. One is there are a lot of a lot of possibilities. Think about it. If we back to 1 month ago, if somebody said there will be mass demonstration happened in big city and they shouted CCP is typed out, nobody will believe that. But it is happening now. That means in the future, I think everything is possible. This is one characteristic. Another characteristic of this demonstration or show us is we have a new generation. I call it awakening generation. I mean, those younger generations. I talked with several mainland students here in Tokyo last night, and I encouraged by them a lot. Maybe all of them said they were fooled around by CCP for many years, and now they realize they have to stand up for their own freedom. I think they are fighting not only for some very abstract concept like democracy or freedom. They are struggling for their own benefit. So this awakening generation is very interesting. Maybe they will decide the future of China. And for what's the outcome of this protest? I think it's not a prediction, it's just guys. I guess the government will try to calm the situation first, as what they did in 1989. Probably they will make some adjustment regarding COVID policy, which they already did. But if their policy changed fair to calm things down, I still believe the government will resort to further violent repression. So I think there's a still possibility, and I'm also worried that there's still possibility of sending forces or even army to crack down to the protest if that happened again. So I also think international community needed to watch closely.
Thanks a lot, Wang Dan. Melinda, I don't think I'm giving anything away when I say that you've got a piece coming out soon, I believe, in Foreign Policy, where you have some thoughts about what we can expect going forward. I wonder, either share those views or others, and then I'm going to give the last word to Orville on this. So, what do you see ahead, Melinda, coming out of these protests?
Okay, I think the battlefield, if that's what we're looking at, is very much more complicated now than in 1989. I think if it was like a two-dimensional chessboard in 1989, now it's become a three-dimensional chessboard because cyberspace, the tussle between censorship of Chinese social media and the way so many images filtered out and got on Twitter and then were able to be viewed because so many more Chinese have VPNs to be able to view Twitter. As people know, Twitter is normally not accessible to people in China, but if you use an app or a VPN, virtual private network, you will be able to see it. I think that and the general tech savviness of Chinese people, in conjunction with the perfection of the surveillance state on the part of the regime. So that is a whole new battlefield, the whole battlefield of technology, surveillance, and stability maintenance, and expressions of freedom, expressions of personal individuality. That thing is going on, and that is actually going to be part of this. I mean, it could be that one battle has already happened and it's now finished. What I would love to hear, maybe just like one sentence from Wang Dan, is, Wang Dan, if you were advising the protesters of today, is there one mistake that you would like to warn them away from? To say, hi guys, I have a little bit of experience in this, and please, I'm begging you, don't do whatever. What is the whatever that you don't think they should do?
It's really a challenging question. Well, actually, I think the new protesters are really smarter than us. I mean, they have the big water tragedy that make the crackdown less likely happen because nobody now in the street now. So I can't imagine how can government to crack down, but nobody there. But I'm worried that they will arrest many young people later, maybe. So if there's some advice I couldn't say advice, but some suggestion for them, I maybe will try to ask them to sometimes you have to slow down your space. Sometimes you have to speed your or push your movement forward. So they have to control by themselves the movement, not enraged by the government. Keep calm down and keep the movement move forward peacefully and with more, how to say, with more thinking, not easily enraged by the government. That's my suggestion.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Melinda. Orville, last word to you. drawing from all of your experience and following these issues so closely over the decades, what do you see coming out of this movement or this recent expression of protest and dissent and grievance? What can we expect coming out? Have things really changed, and should we expect more in the future?
Well, one thing I think is worth noting, even those of us who study China had never predicted any of these inflection points very well. And I think all of us have suggested that it would be folly to say that this is somehow a massive turning point moment and the square will flood next Tuesday when Jiang Zemin's memorial takes place, just as it did in '89. However, let me just read one line to you, that this was what Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet and essayist, said when he got his Nobel Peace Prize. He said, in a room where people unanimously maintain a conspiracy of silence, one word of truth sounds like a pistol shot. And I think that's a little bit what we're experiencing now. For the first time in 10 years, some Chinese have dared say things that we knew they were thinking, but they never could say. And they were uttered in public. What does this mean? Well, I really don't know. But I do think it does suggest, as I said at the outset, that beneath the surface of things, there is a lot more going on in China than we're able to see in the media, we're able to see even in if you are in China. And it just means that China is one of the least resolved societies of consequence in the globe today, and that they are going to be working out this struggle between control and liberty for many, many decades to come.
Thank you so much, Orville. I think with that, we'll draw us to a close. Let me encourage everyone watching to please notify others who haven't been able to watch that this has been recorded and will be available for reviewing within a few minutes or so, later on today. And in so doing, let me encourage you also to please visit the websites of the Center for China Analysis, as well as the website of the Center for U.S. China Relations at the Asia Society, where we're doing all sorts of interesting work, both of our centers, to try and help governments, business, society, not just in the United States, but around the world, come to a better understanding about China and our future with China going forward. So thank you very much to all of you for viewing. My special thanks to this fantastic panel, Melinda Liu, Wang Dan, Wu Guoguang, and Orville Schell. Fantastic conversation. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be interacting with all of you, and I'm looking forward to another chance to do so, hopefully in the not too distant future. With that, I'll bring today's event to a close. Thank you, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you all again soon.
Okay, bye-bye.